There is one concept you must nail if you want to get better at photography. That is the exposure triangle. Exposure is the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor. To put it simply, how bright or dark the image is. The exposure triangle tells us that getting your image exposed correctly is a balancing act among aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three camera settings all influence your image's exposure. Aperture is the depth of field of your image. Shutter speed controls the amount of time your camera sensor is exposed to light, and ISO controls your camera sensitivity to light. If you want a more in-depth explanation, you can click on the card on the top right for those videos. If you have watched those videos, it's time to bring together everything you've been learning. The triangle tells us how our image will be influenced from certain camera settings in terms of lighting and visual effects. There is a sweet spot among all three camera settings where an image is not too dark or underexposed and not too bright or overexposed. And I will guide you on how to figure out that sweet spot. The best way to conceptualize this is if we go over some scenarios you might find yourself in. Let's say you're taking portraits for your dating app or social media, and you want to get some separation from the background, that blurry background look. You will need a wide aperture which will brighten your image. As you can see, the image here is way too overexposed and you can't really see anything. To compensate for the extra brightness, you should either use a faster shutter speed or drop your ISO. Another scenario you might find yourself in is if you're out in nature, you want to take a photo of the landscape and you need the background to be sharp. You will need a narrow aperture which will darken your image, but the image is now too dark and you can't really see anything. To compensate for the extra darkness, you will either need to use a slower shutter speed or increase your ISO. You're starting to see how everything you've been learning is starting to come together. There is a pattern forming here, and if you haven't seen it yet, you will after the next few scenarios. Okay, I'm gonna go off the script just for a bit. I recently posted a short and it got a lot of traction and it netted in a few new subscribers, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your support. It means a lot to me. Doing YouTube has always been a dream for me ever since I was a kid, and your support is confirmation to me that I'm doing something right. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the video. Let's say you're photographing cars through the street and you want to freeze the action. You're gonna need a fast shutter speed, but a faster shutter speed will darken your image and you risk underexposure. You'll have to brighten up the image again by either opening up the aperture or increasing your ISO. On the flip side, if you want to take light trails of cars, you're going to need a slower shutter speed, which will brighten your image, and now you risk overexposure. So to darken the image and balance it out, you're going to either need a more narrow aperture or drop your ISO. Now, I'm sure you're seeing a pattern forming here. If this video taught you something new, please hit the like button so this video can spread to more beginner photographers. Let's get a little edgy and say you actually want to introduce that grain in your image. I don't know why you might want that, but hey, to each their own. Maybe you want it for the aesthetic, but I personally don't like grain, but you know, let's roll with it. You'll be shooting with a high ISO, and in order to compensate for that, you'll either have to darken the image by using a faster shutter speed or a more narrow aperture. On the other hand, if you want to reduce grain, you will need a lower ISO, and to re-brighten up the image, you'll need a more open aperture or a slower shutter speed. Remember, when you're shooting with slow shutter speeds, you're gonna need a tripod to steady the shot to reduce any amount of camera shake that'll be introduced by your hand. These examples we just walked through illustrate how you must be thinking when trying to properly expose your image and get the visual effects that you want. Personally, when I step onto a scene, here's what goes through my head. What visual effects do I want? Do I want a blurry background or a bokeh effect? Or do I want a sharp background? Do I want motion blur or do I want frozen action? After figuring out what visual effects I want, the next thing is to adjust the ISO. I think to myself, what is the lowest ISO I can shoot at that still correctly exposes the image and reduces the amount of grain? And after all that, I adjust the shutter speed or aperture accordingly. Usually, I use a faster shutter speed to minimize the amount of camera shake introduced by my hand if I'm not shooting with a tripod. Getting the right exposure and visual effects is not easy, especially if you're shooting outdoors and at the mercy of the weather. Now that you're aware of how to correctly expose an image, you should dive into what makes a photo more interesting. I'm currently working on a video on the rule of thirds, and whenever that is finished, it will be linked here on the screen.